Hey everyone, I'm Alex from Cytonox, and today I'll be ranking the dungeons of The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword. It's been a long time since we talked about Zelda here, almost an entire year in fact. Some neat Cytonox trivia is that Zelda is probably the series that most inspired me to form this channel with Jack along with Metroid. I watched a ton of dungeon ranking videos as a kid and it inspired me to take a crack at it, so believe it or not, I've actually been doing this since I was little. I've even got my old Ocarina of Time dungeon ranking from when I was 11 years old lying around my room. So if you guys want to thank anybody for the existence of Cytonox, thank two guys playing Zelda and Speedy Man. Anyways, now that I'm done with high school, I just went and replayed all the 3D Zelda games for the hell of it and figured it's about time I show one of my favorite franchises some love. Unlike with Breath of the Wild, which, love it as I do, admittedly had lame-ass garbage dungeons, the other games have actual cool ones worth talking about. Hence, all the other games will get a dungeon ranking and not just a boss ranking. Skyward Sword is an interesting game, and definitely the one I have the hardest time making my mind up on. It has some of the series' best dungeons and some pretty solid bosses, but the controls suck and there's always a heap of boring filler bullshit between every dungeon to pad the length out. I'd say it falls on the worst end of the 3D Zelda games for me as a whole, but dungeon-wise it's probably an astounding second place behind Twilight Princess. The re-release for the Switch was nice since it gave me the option to play it like a normal game without motion controls, so that's what all the gameplay here is from. Anyways, with that out of the way, let's get into it. Like with most of the 3D Zelda games, none of the dungeons are really outright unpleasant or anything. This one is a by-the-books final Zelda dungeon where they mesh all the other dungeons into one giant clusterfuck. I usually hate these things, but the Skykeep is honestly by far the least annoying in the series. It mainly lays claim to the bottom rung of the list because it's unoriginal as hell and that room based around the Earth Temple is one of the most irritating rooms in a Zelda game ever. I don't even know what they were thinking with this one. The speed at which the lava sends you through the tunnel is agonizing, and if you mess up, you've got to do it all over again, which happened to me several times. My rule for Zelda games is I use a guide for the overworld stuff, but completely ban myself from cheating in the dungeons, and this is one part where I was really seething over my own cluelessness. I also thought it was sort of funny how disinterested I was in collecting pieces of the Triforce. These things are supposedly immensely powerful, but you might as well be picking up red rupees the way the game treats it. I've never thought the Zelda games did a great job of showcasing how powerful the Triforce is, save for maybe Twilight Princess though, so this isn't anything new. That said, the other rooms were far less frustrating and the puzzle of changing the dungeon's layout was cool at least. I always prefer dungeons where it's not just a one puzzle per room gauntlet, but rather one that forces you to think of the entire thing as one large puzzle to be solved. Some other dungeons I'd say fall into this territory are the Grey Bay Temple from Majora's Mask and the Sand Ship from way higher up on this list. Obviously, this quality alone doesn't automatically make a dungeon amazing, hence cases like this one in the Water Temple, but at the very least grants it the honor of not being atrocious rubbish like almost every other final dungeon in the series. Skyview Temple is a perfectly inoffensive introductory dungeon with a cool new to the series item and puzzles just thoughtful enough to not fall into the brain-dead intro dungeon stereotype. It just happens to be up against some very stiff competition, so it doesn't stand out much. While all the other dungeons have some kind of central theme that provides visual flair, this one is pretty bleh. It's not ugly, but there's just nothing too distinct about it. It's the dungeon equivalent of an unfurnished house. Glowing mushrooms alone can't comprise a memorable aesthetic. The vine swinging near the end was also very frustrating. I almost always hate swinging mechanics in any game, but this is one of the most flagrantly janky of them all. The beetle is an awesome new addition to the item roster at least, and along with the spinner from Twilight Princess makes for a compelling argument to add weirder, more out-there dungeon items in the future. Not much else to add. I've never met anyone who doesn't share this exact opinion on the Skyview Temple. The Earth Temple is a pretty major improvement over the Skyview Temple. The visuals are amazing, for one. Everybody loves the lava textures, but I'd also like to shout out the architecture. I love all the decorative faces and stuff littering the walls, and I think they add a lot of personality to the place. Gameplay-wise, it's solid. The bombs are a boring and trite second dungeon item, so that wasn't too interesting, but I did sorta like the boulder running thing, if only for how novel it is. In general, I think the line between good and bad dungeon items is the amount of utilities it has and how varied they are. If all you ever use bombs for is blowing up obvious cracked walls or chucking them into baskets, there's not much to get excited over. Items with more freedom in use like the hookshot are favorites because they can be used for combat, fun traversal, and any other number of fun things in Twilight Princess. So the Earth Temple, with bombs as the star of the show on the puzzle front, isn't tossing many brain busters your way. Platforming was definitely the stronger suit between the two. The coolest part was that Indiana Jones-style boulder chase near the end. They totally knew what they were doing with that bit. These shortcomings are excusable given it's the second dungeon, and overall I'd say Skyward Sword has a really good dungeon difficulty curve, if not the best one in the series. While at first glance this is pretty much Earth Temple Redux, it's got a lot more going on than its early game counterpart. For starters, it's pretty tricky. I think this is the second hardest dungeon in the game just behind the sand ship, and I got totally stuck at one part for like 20 minutes. I don't know if I'm the only person in this boat, but I couldn't for the life of me figure out if you were supposed to fling one of those water balloon things onto that guy's tongue. I just assumed that wasn't like a thing you could do. I'm also a fan of the outside areas. You don't see those too often in dungeons, and I thought these especially looked amazing. That skydiving stunt you pull for the boss key is also a novel concept. I would generally call this an upgrade over the Earth Temple in every way, although I found the digging mechanic annoying due to how slow it is. If I wanted to torture myself watching someone crawl around in a hole, I'd watch that South Park episode where Mr. Slave puts a gerbil up his anus. The Fire Temple has its share of shortcomings, but they're largely offset by the fun factor of the rest of the dungeon. This top 3 was pretty tough to rank, since all of these are, in my opinion, S-tier dungeons that are some of the best the series has to offer. If you thought the Earth Temple was too easy, this is where the game decides to shut you up. It's not necessarily one of the hardest dungeons of all time, but it is an enormous spike up from the Earth Temple. The 2 time periods being superimposed onto one essentially has you keeping track of 2 rooms for every one you come across, which is a really interesting gimmick that I'm glad featured heavily in the game at large. The contrast between the dull as rocks present facility and the vibrant past facility is stunning, and the puzzles the old technology brings are all very fresh for the most part. The nuance and flexibility it gives the designers is a stroke of genius, since it adds these unique layers like, do I want this time stone active, how do I activate this time shift stone, if so, etc. I was real proud of myself whenever I worked out what to do in some of these rooms. Whoever thought of the gust bellows is also a genius. For what looks like a stupid worthless junk item, it's honestly one of the most fun new additions in the game, and is yet another thing Skyward Sword did really well that I haven't seen replicated much in the other games. It seriously is a bummer that the segments between the dungeons were also unbearably awful, because this had potential to be a top 3 Zelda game for me otherwise. The Lanayru mining facility is an astoundingly inventive dungeon that puts like 85% of this series' other dungeons to shame, but unfortunately for the mining facility it just so happens that 2 of that top 15% happen to reside in the same game. Yet another fascinating dungeon right here. The Ancient Cistern has a lot of the traits I've praised in other dungeons, but none of the faults. The whip is a cool new item, the architecture is memorable and interesting, and the difficulty is just right. The good side, bad side thing is really interesting, even if it's been done before, and as I'm sure you've gathered from my commentary in the mining facility, I'm a big fan of contrasting designs. This is without a doubt the most painless water dungeon in the series, although I'm sure that's not a wholly accurate classification. It's a hybrid dungeon, I guess, which keeps the water stuff from getting too monotonous while still being a usable element in puzzles. The whip was nice since it let you reach through bars among other things, which opened up a lot of possibilities. The progression is very tangible since you can see the giant Buddha head in the middle move based on your activation of various levers, so you always have a decent idea of how far through you are. There's a whole mythos this dungeon is based on reflected through the Buddhist symbolism and references to Buddhist stories, which is fascinating in its own right, although definitely unexpected in a Nintendo game, let alone a Zelda game. If you weren't aware, Nintendo has an absolute ironclad policy of avoiding real-life religious references, which came out back in Ocarina of Time's early days if you wanted some neat trivia. The fast version of that story is the original gold cartridge Fire Temple music included chanting that was actually Islamic in origin unbeknownst to Nintendo, and when they found out they quickly changed the music and discontinued the original versions. I actually possess one of these original N64 gold cartridges myself, believe it or not, which is sorta neat. Anyways, this entire dungeon was a memorable and entertaining experience that falls just short of top rank only due to being a bit easier than the remaining dungeon. The Sand Ship is probably one of, if not the least flawed dungeons in the series, along with the other all-time greats like the City in the Sky. All the praise I had for the Lanayru mining facility transfers here, but now the setting is even more interesting and the puzzles are more creative with the addition of the bow into the mix. The bow has always been a fun item, and nowhere is it ever better utilized than right here. Clearing paths to shoot the time crystal and knowing when to use them is great as always, and the visuals are even better with the setting of the Sand Sea. This area is not only the lone pre-dungeon segment in the game that doesn't suck, but is even pretty cool. The mini-boss is one of the most enjoyable and creative mini-bosses in the series as well. Pushing him back till he's got nowhere to go is a fun gimmick. This dungeon is hard. I got stumped a number of times, and solving it without a guide was immensely gratifying and left a good taste in my mouth. Ironically enough, this is where I rage quit the game as a kid back when I had the Wii version, since I wasn't able to figure out what to do, and I didn't have internet access back then. I'm born in 2003, so I was probably one of the last people to ever get use out of gaming guidebooks before they faded into irrelevancy now that I think about it. Anyways, for amazing puzzles, design, creativity, and perfect length, I bestow upon the sand ship the honor of being the best dungeon in Skyward Sword. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. I'll be covering the bosses of Skyward Sword soon enough, so be sure to catch that when it's out if you were a fan of this video. That's all for now. Deuces.